A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hi Herman and Corin, we've talked about sleep in a number of episodes, and I guess it's one of those curious things that we spend about a third of our lives asleep and probably about 1/500th of our lifetime thinking and talking about the process of sleeping. And if we looked at, I guess, how much money we spent on our mattress versus how much money we spent on, a fancy pair of headphones we use once a week, we'd probably realize the way we spend money is deeply illogical, as is what we think about. So we might do some more episodes about sleep, and I have in my family, specifically my father-in-law, Emmett Schneiderman, who we did an episode about before, who is academically involved in the world of sleep. And I think in the future I want to do this one today because I'm greedy and I want to know the answer. But I'd love to send one or two scripts to his review, so we can say that our episodes are not only reviewed by 3 passes of Gemini 3.1, but occasionally a human actually takes a look at them, and not only a human, but a human who knows what they're talking about, because I can't always step up to that bar. So today, Herman and Corin, I'd love to chat about sleep architecture. It's one of those things we hear about a lot. If you read about sort of sleep hygiene, you'll read about the importance of it and things that disturb it, and I'd love to understand exactly what that means. As you know, Hannah and I have our little son Ezra, and as a new parent you learn a bit about sleep architecture, that for the first few months of their lives babies don't secrete melatonin, and it's kind of just random. We also talked about another point of connection to our previous chats, is the history of sleep itself and biphasic sleep, and the debate in the sleep community about whether humans are inherently biphasic sleepers, or that was just a product of the times. In other words, at a certain point in history there was time for what was called, I think, the wake or the watch, and people just kind of rolled with it. We also talked about polyphasic sleeping and how that in general has not been very successful for any group of people, and how anyone who spent time on oil rigs or in the Navy will tell you that it's not a whole bunch of fun. So what I'd love to chat about is the more normal people, or the more normal sleep architecture that we see. We often hear that sedatives are really bad for sleep architecture, and I'm talking about CNS sedatives like alcohol as well as sleeping pills. I've mentioned that I've taken a sleep medication that I'm really trying to get off the end of my taper for a couple of years now. That's a long failed end of taper, and it really does a great job at getting you to sleep, which at the time that I began taking it was great, and it actually makes you perversely really appreciate sleep more when you're dealing with. We moved into our current apartment. There was a ton of noise, and it was just literally stressing me out to the point I couldn't get to sleep because the honks would wake me up. And when you're at that point, you're at the end of your tether, and the lack of sleep makes you more stressed. When you get out for 10 hours, chemically or naturally, you wake up feeling like a new person, and it makes you really appreciate how vital sleep is. But there is a catch, and the catch is that the sleep architecture is disrupted, and it's not the same as naturally restorative sleep. So I'd love to talk, Herman and Corin, about what is sleep architecture. We know about REM, but there's different phases to it. And what's interesting as well, connecting back to the point about Ezra and young children, is that this isn't something that arrives on a plate to us. We develop this like so many other things are developed. So how does that process evolve? How long does it take for us to develop and stabilize our sleep architecture? And is there any hope for people like me who've been on a sleep med for a couple of years, and we really want to get back to a more normal state where not only do we not need to take this, we get past the initial taper, which is what makes getting off this stuff kind of brutal, but we want to get back to the way our brains were before that we do our sleep hygiene, right? We block out blue light, we get into a dark space, we put our phones away. Is there any hope that one can get back to a normal and healthy sleep pattern after being on these for a few years? Over to you two.
Herman, I have been watching you shuffle those research papers for the last 20 minutes, and I have to say, for a donkey, you have surprisingly nimble hooves. You look like you are preparing for a legal defense, or perhaps a very intense trivia night.
It is a bit of both, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I am actually diving into today's prompt from Daniel, which is all about the biological architecture of sleep. He wants us to deconstruct how our brains build a night of rest, how that structure changes from infancy to old age, and most importantly, whether a brain that has been chemically sidelined by sleep medications for years can actually find its way back to a natural rhythm.
Sleep architecture. I love that phrasing because it implies that sleep isn't just a basement we fall into at night. It is a multi-story building with specific rooms and functions. I think most people assume sleep is just a light switch. You are on, then you are off, and if you are unconscious for 8 hours, you win. But Daniel is pointing us toward the idea that the quality of the construction matters more than the time spent on the lot.
That is the perfect way to frame it. When we talk about sleep architecture, we are talking about the hypnogram. That is the technical map of how you move through different stages of sleep throughout the night. It is not a flat line. It is a series of cycles, usually 4 to 6 of them, and each one lasts roughly 90 to 120 minutes. If you look at a healthy hypnogram, it looks like a staircase that goes down into the deep basement of slow wave sleep and then jumps back up toward the surface for rapid eye movement sleep, or REM.
And I assume the rooms in this building have very different purposes. You can't just hang out in the hallway all night and expect to feel rested.
You really can't. We divide it into 2 main categories, non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. The non-REM side is split into 3 stages. Stage N1 is just that light transition where you are drifting off. If someone says your name, you might jump and claim you weren't even asleep. Stage N2 is where the real work begins. This makes up about 50% of your total night. Your brain starts producing these little bursts of activity called sleep spindles and K-complexes. We think these are critical for memory consolidation and protecting the brain from being woken up by outside noises.
So N2 is like the security guard of the sleep cycle. It is checking the perimeter and making sure the files are being filed correctly. But what about the heavy lifting, the deep stuff?
That is stage N3, also known as slow wave sleep or delta sleep. This is the physical restoration phase. Your heart rate drops, your breathing slows, and your brain waves become these long, slow oscillations between 0.5 and 4 Hz. This is when growth hormone is released, and it is also when the glymphatic system turns on. Think of it as a literal power washing of the brain. The space between your brain cells increases, and cerebral spinal fluid flushes out metabolic waste, like beta amyloid, which is linked to Alzheimer's.
I have always liked the idea of my brain having a nightly car wash. It explains why I feel so dusty when I don't get enough N3. But then we have REM, the paradoxical sleep. Why do we call it paradoxical?
Because if I looked at your brain waves during REM, I would think you were wide awake. Your brain is incredibly active, your eyes are darting around under your lids, and your heart rate goes up. But your body is in a state of muscle atonia, which is a fancy way of saying you are temporarily paralyzed so you don't act out your dreams. This is the stage for emotional processing and complex problem solving. It is fascinating because a report in PLOS Biology from just a few days ago, March 24, 26, suggests that this immersive dreaming acts as a psychological buffer. It helps you feel more rested emotionally even if your physical metrics are a bit off.
So if N3 is the car wash for the engine, REM is the therapist for the driver. But Daniel's prompt also asks about how this changes over time. We know he has a son, Ezra, who is still quite young, and I imagine Ezra's sleep architecture looks nothing like ours.
It is vastly different. In newborns like Ezra, sleep is polyphasic, meaning it happens in short bursts throughout the day and night rather than one consolidated block. Their cycles are much shorter, maybe 50 to 60 minutes, and they spend about 50% of their time in REM sleep. This is crucial because their brains are growing at an astronomical rate, and REM is the primary driver of that neural development.
I remember you telling me about the 4-month regression. Is that when the architecture starts to shift toward the adult model?
Well, not exactly, but you are on the right track. Around 3 to 4 months, the brain undergoes a major biological shift. The infant starts to develop those distinct NREM stages. It is often a nightmare for parents because the baby is essentially learning a new way to sleep, but it takes a long time to stabilize. It usually isn't until age 5 or 6 that the sleep cycle duration reaches that adult 90 to 120-minute mark.
And then we hit the teenage years, where the architecture gets weird again. I saw a study from JAMA Network Open earlier this month, mentioning that almost a quarter of teens are getting 5 hours of sleep or less. That has to be wrecking their architecture.
It is a disaster, honestly. Teens have what we call a circadian phase delay. Their brains don't start releasing melatonin until about 2 hours later than adults or younger children. Their internal clock is literally telling them to stay up until midnight and sleep until 10 in the morning. When we force them into a 7 a.m. school schedule, we aren't just making them tired, we are cutting off the end of their sleep cycles, which is where the majority of REM sleep happens. They are essentially living in a state of emotional and cognitive REM deprivation.
It is a systemic architectural failure. But let's get to the heavy hitter in Daniel's prompt, the medication aspect. There are so many people who have been on things like Zolpidem, which is Ambien or Ezopiclone or even sedating antidepressants like Seroquel for years. They feel like they are sleeping, but we often talk about how sedation is not sleep. What is happening to the architecture when those drugs are in the system?
This is where we have to be very precise. Most common sleep medications are GABAergic hypnotics. They work by enhancing the activity of GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. They basically turn down the volume on the whole central nervous system. While this makes you unconscious, it often suppresses the power density of those slow-wave delta waves in stage N3. It also tends to fragment or suppress REM sleep.
So you are basically putting a tarp over the building instead of actually maintaining it. You are unconscious, but the power washing and the therapy sessions aren't happening at the level they should be.
That is the sedation trap. You wake up feeling like you slept because you don't remember being awake, but your brain hasn't actually completed its architectural duties. And if you do this for several years, your brain starts to downregulate its own natural receptors. It says, well, if this medication is going to do the job of GABA, I don't need to make as much or be as sensitive to it.
Which leads to the big question. Can you fix it? If you have been on these meds for 5 or 10 years, is the architecture permanently condemned? Or can you renovate?
The good news is that the brain is incredibly neuroplastic, especially when it comes to homeostatic drives like sleep, but you cannot just pull the plug and expect everything to work overnight. The European Neuropsychopharmacology Consensus that came out earlier this year really emphasized a structured recovery. If you stop cold turkey, you get what we call rebound architecture.
Rebound architecture sounds like a very stressful interior design show. I am guessing it involves a lot of REM?
It is intense. Your brain has been starved of REM and N3 for so long that when the drug is gone, it tries to make up for it all at once. You get these vivid, often terrifying dreams, and you might spend almost the entire night in a fragmented REM state. It is exhausting. This is why the clinical guidelines suggest a very slow taper, often reducing the dose by only 10 to 25% per week, or even slower if someone has been on it for a decade.
We talked about this in episode 540, the difference between sedation and restorative rest, and again in episode 45 when we looked at the specific pharmacology of tapering Seroquel. The consensus seems to be that patience is the only way through.
It really is. The timeline for recovery is longer than most people want to hear. The acute withdrawal, the shaky, sweaty, I can't sleep at all phase, usually lasts 1 to 4 weeks. But the actual recalibration of those GABA receptors takes 2 to 6 months. And for the sleep architecture to fully return to a stable natural baseline where your N3 and REM are properly balanced, that can take 6 to 18 months.
18 months. That is a long time to commit to a renovation project while you are still living in the house. But I suppose the alternative is just letting the building crumble further.
And the brain wants to heal. That is the thing people forget. Your homeostatic sleep drive is one of the most powerful forces in your biology. If you give it the right environment and the right cues, it will eventually rebuild those cycles. But you have to pair the taper with something like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. You have to retrain the brain to associate the bed with sleep rather than the anxiety of not sleeping.
I think one of the most interesting things Daniel brought up, or at least hinted at with his background in technology, is how we track this. We are seeing a lot of movement in sleep tech. Stanford just released that Sleep FM model in January, right?
Yes, Sleep FM is a massive leap forward. Dr. Emmanuel Mignot and his team trained this AI model on 600,000 hours of sleep data. It is a foundation model for sleep. They found that they could predict over 100 different diseases just from a single night's recording because our sleep architecture is a mirror of our overall health. If your N3 is declining faster than it should for your age, that is a biomarker for neurodegeneration.
It is like having a structural engineer who can look at the blueprints of your house and tell you if the foundation is cracking before you even see a gap in the wall. But there is a bit of a warning there too, right? The National Sleep Foundation put out a statement just yesterday about consumer trackers.
Dr. Azizi Seixas led that. Their point is that while your wrist-worn tracker is great for seeing roughly when you fell asleep, it is not a medical-grade polysomnography machine. People get orthosomnia, which is a new term for the anxiety caused by trying to get the perfect sleep score on an app. If your watch tells you that you had 0 REM sleep but you feel fine, trust your body over the watch. The sensors on a wristband are mostly measuring movement and heart rate, which are proxies for sleep stages, not direct measurements of brain waves.
I love the irony of people staying awake at night worrying about their sleep data. It is the most human thing ever. But if we are looking at practical takeaways for someone like Daniel or any listener who wants to improve their structural integrity, where do we start?
You start with the anchors. Your circadian rhythm needs strong, consistent signals to know when to build which floor of the sleep house. The first anchor is light. You need bright, natural light in your eyes as soon as possible after waking up. That tells the suprachiasmatic nucleus in your brain to start the timer for melatonin production 12 to 14 hours later.
And the second anchor?
Temperature. Your core body temperature needs to drop by about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit to initiate and stay in deep sleep. This is why a cool room around 65 degrees is so effective. If your room is too hot, your brain will struggle to stay in stage N3 because the metabolic heat from that power washing process has nowhere to go.
I have always said that being a sloth is a biological advantage. We are naturally cool and we don't move much. It is the perfect architectural setup. But what about the people who are currently on medication and want to start that recovery journey? What is the first step for them?
The first step is a conversation with a specialist, specifically someone who understands the difference between a simple insomnia diagnosis and a long-term dependency on hypnotics. You want someone who can help you set up a microtaper. And you have to embrace the idea of the anchor sleep. Even if you only sleep 4 hours of natural sleep, if those 4 hours are consistent every night, your brain can start to expand the architecture from that foundation.
It is about consistency over intensity. You can't force a deep sleep cycle any more than you can force a tree to grow faster by pulling on the leaves. You just have to provide the soil and the water and wait.
That is exactly it. And we should mention that some of the newer medications, like the orexin receptor antagonists, things like suvorexant, work differently. They don't just sedate the whole brain, they specifically turn off the wakefulness system. Initial research suggests they might be less disruptive to sleep architecture than the older GABAergic drugs, but we are still in the early days of seeing how those play out over years of use.
It is a fascinating time to be a sleeper. We have AI models like Sleep FM analyzing our cycles. We have a better understanding of the glymphatic system than ever before, and we are finally moving away from the idea that being knocked out by a pill is the same thing as resting.
It really is a shift in the paradigm. We are moving from a world of quantity. How many hours did you get, to a world of quality and structure? And for someone who has used medication for years, the path back is not a straight line. It is going to be messy. There will be nights of rebound REM where you feel like you are living in a fever dream, but that is actually a sign of your brain recovering its lost territory.
It is the brain reclaiming the deed to its own house. I think that is a very hopeful message. It might take 18 months to fully renovate, but you are building something that will last you the rest of your life.
And we shouldn't forget the evolutionary context. We talked about this in episode 1514 about how the 8-hour block might be a bit of a modern invention anyway. Our ancestors might have had a more biphasic or fragmented structure, but the core stages, The N3 and the REM have always been the non-negotiables. Biology doesn't care about your work schedule. It cares about clearing out the adenosine and processing the day's emotions.
Well, Herman, I think we have sufficiently deconstructed the blueprints for today. I feel like I need to go find a very cold, very dark room and practice some N3 maintenance myself.
Just make sure you get some morning light first, Corn. We don't want your suprachiasmatic nucleus getting confused.
Oh, don't worry. My internal clock is set to sloth time, which is basically perpetual nap readiness. This has been an incredible deep dive. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It is always good to remember that sleep is a skill our brains practice every single night. We just have to give them the right environment to do the work.
It is the most important work we do while doing absolutely nothing.
Truly the dream. Before we go, we have to say a huge thank you to our producer, Hilbert Flumentop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation and research processing for this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without that kind of computational muscle.
If you want to dig into our archives, including those episodes we mentioned on sedation and tapering, head over to myweirdprompts.com. You can find the full RSS feed and all the ways to subscribe there.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
Stay rested, everyone, or at least stay architecturally sound. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth for man, from